Hello, you're watching Global Insight with me, Oh Seong. From Arirang News Centre in Seoul, we speak with experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. Trade wars, division, building borders and nationalism have become everyday language in recent years. The merits of globalization, the free flow of goods, services, money and people transcending borders, emboldened by international norms and institutions based on liberal democracy, have all but dissolved into a bitter aftertaste of unequal economic growth and quality of life within and between societies. The rise of autocratic leaders around the world has further challenged what we thought were globally shared values on trade, diplomacy and even democracy. These structural shifts in the world order have been made all the more apparent by the COVID-19 pandemic, and there have been questions on whether countries can piece back together a working world order and a strong economic recovery. For this, we are very honoured to speak with Martin Wolf, Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator for the Financial Times, a world-renowned journalist, economist and author decorated with numerous awards for his sharp analysis and insights on the global economy. Mr. Wolf is one of the leading public thinkers of our time. As we head into 2021, we really want to pick his brain today on how the post-COVID-19 era will look and moreover, how the world should look. Well, welcome, Mr. Wolf, and thank you so much for making time for us. It's a real honour to have you as our guest.
It's a great pleasure.
Well, if we could go straight into the questions. Well, over the last decade, we've seen the rise of autocratic leaders, illiberal democracies, and a general backlash against Western-style values and multilateral institutions. And, well, President-elect Joe Biden in the US says he intends to restore America's relationship with its allies and put itself at the head of the table again. But do you think the US will have as much authority as it did before in the post-pandemic world?
I think the answer to that is no, it won't. Partly because of the experience with Mr. Trump, partly because Mr. Biden himself will be hamstrung by Congress. He won't control it completely. And partly, of course, because it's quite obvious that the Republicans will still be there, and we may well have another president like Mr. Trump, or maybe Mr. Trump himself. At the same time, there isn't another leader, at least for the West, for the democratic world. If that's going to survive at all, really, it's not plausible that we can do without American leadership, or at least an enormously powerful American role. And we've experienced that with Mr. Trump. So I think there'll be a lot of goodwill towards him, and there will be a hope that it will work out, but it's going to be very difficult to restore the unquestioned primacy of the United States before the last 10 years, and particularly before the last 4 years.
Well, while the world they gave a sigh of relief really when Joe Biden was elected as the next US president, but it was quite shocking to see that more than 70 million Americans voted to re-elect Donald Trump as their president. And well, we've seen over the past decade, we've seen similar sort of discontent and disillusionment with globalization around the world. But if the fundamental issues aren't addressed, if these people continue to feel left behind, then do you think we might see another sort of Donald Trump phenomenon take place?
Very much so. It seems to me, I'm actually writing a book about this at the moment, which is nearly finished. It seems to me that Donald Trump is the product of a long history of economic disappointment and social change, which are linked but not quite the same, followed by the global financial crisis of 2008. And so the roots of this, and you see similar things, not quite the same, with Brexit in Britain, similar rise of right-wing nationalism in many developed countries, and of course autocratic rulers in Brazil and so forth. And often the root is economic disappointment. And this is not going to be fixed in a year or two. Part of it is really deeply structural and is almost impossible to change. And part of it is as a result of policies which are very difficult to change.
And it seems these deep structural problems, they're becoming aggravated in a sense because over the course of the pandemic, some sectors such as IT, they fared quite well. But for most businesses and workers, it's not clear that there'll be a strong recovery, whether there'll be an immediate recovery, and moreover, whether all the jobs will be coming back. And it seems that most robust industries right now, they need minimal human labor, really throwing the notion of productivity into question. So how do you think countries should really address this unemployment crisis that we're facing and the very stagnant wages that we've also experienced?
It is, I think, crucial to understand that the COVID-19 impact was slightly different, in fact, significantly different from that of the previous change. The previous change, the long-standing change, if you like, the long-standing change was deindustrialization. And you mentioned this, the decline in the industrial labor force, really everywhere, but in all developed countries. The industrial labor force was predominantly male. Very large proportion of it were people who hadn't been to university, less educated people. And that, as you said, is shrinking dramatically. And that's not going to reverse. And that has reduced the role of less educated men in the workforce, which has been coincided with the huge social changes, the change in the role of women economically, socially, and that's created a lot of unhappy people. Now, COVID-19 has actually attacked less educated, on the whole, less educated women, people working in the service sector, in restaurants, in things connected with tourism. These have been the people most adversely affected. So we found it tends to be ethnic minorities, less educated people, particularly women, who have been most affected. So it's again the less educated, and of course lots and lots of small business owners who are being very badly affected. And those were not the people who were most affected before. So we've added, as it were, a new group of people, very large group of people, to the list of people who are not doing very well. With luck, the latter effect, the effects of COVID-19, will be reversed, at least in significant measure. But finally, as you've said, the tech sector and everything that is enabled by the tech sector has done spectacularly well. A lot of office workers, people like me, have done fine. It hasn't really affected us. So it has exacerbated inequality in a very complicated way.
And well, after the financial crisis of 2008, you warned against prematurely cutting off government support and really pushing for austerity. But then after this crisis, how do you think government should prepare for a strong recovery once we do reopen fully in the post-pandemic period?
It's going to be a difficult period for sure, partly because it's going to take quite a while to get full control over COVID-19. Even if the vaccines fully work and they give protection, covering the entire population of the world is going to be an enormous task, and it's going to go well beyond 2021. And if the disease is not sort of brought under full control with herd immunity everywhere, nowhere will be completely safe. We won't restore movement of people, a very important part of our world economy, quickly. So I think we've got to think of this as being a longish haul even now. And the likelihood is if we don't recover strongly, we will have enduring losses. We will never fully regain the trajectory we hoped for before the crisis. So I think the single most important thing is to sustain demand from government. Of course, government deficits should decline as their workforces start working again, people start working again. But we have to sustain demand. Monetary policy is not very effective anymore. Essentially, we're at zero interest rates. The central banks have expanded balance sheets enormously already. So it has to be fiscal policy. And the enormous advantage of the present situation, despite all the problems, is, of course, that debt is very, very cheap. I mean, essentially costless. Real interest rates for the major countries are negative. So the governments can borrow very, very cheaply. Debt service costs are extraordinarily low. They need to borrow very long term to minimize the risk of rising rates. But if they do so, and if the central banks support them in this, I think they can sustain fiscal support for a long time, and that will help. It won't make it perfect, but will help give us a strong recovery.
And well, for the long run, how do you think countries like South Korea, which were seeing rather sluggish growth even before the pandemic, how can these kind of countries boost productivity and grow their economies in the long run?
Well, of course, looking at it in the longer run, South Korea has been one of the world's miracle economies. Almost nowhere and nowhere as large has gone as far so quickly as South Korea. But South Korea, of course, is now a rich country. So it's much more difficult to grow quickly when you're already quite a productive economy, or indeed a very productive economy. And so growth has slowed. Productivity at the frontier of the world economy has tended to slow. That's very clear since the financial crisis. In all the major developed countries, productivity growth has been relatively slow. I think there are deep structural reasons for that, which can't change. It's because of how our economy shifts as we get rich. It becomes a service-based economy. Many of these services are inherently labor-intensive. They can't be replaced with machines. The care sector, the hospital sector, it's very difficult to replace it. And of course, South Korea, very much so, is an aging country, as is true of many developed countries, both in East Asia and in Europe. And aging countries, the labor force grows more slowly than the population. And it's the labor force that ultimately determines growth. So while I think it is possible to do, pretty well, and of course, South Korea is already rich, as I mentioned, a really rapid growth is just not possible for developed countries. Indeed, we have to expect, I think, as aging proceeds, that growth will continue to slow. That's normal and natural. It's the product of success. And I think we just have to live with a world of relatively slow growth.
And do you think there are any areas of potential collaboration between South Korea and perhaps the UK, as the UK has been inking post-Brexit trade deals with countries around the world, including South Korea? I mean, do you see any opportunities for them to cooperate on new industries such as green infrastructure or 5G?
Well, in the case of 5G, I think it will be more a case of importing into our country. If we're not going to use Huawei, and that seems to be now accepted, we have a very limited number of potential suppliers, and one of them is pretty obviously South Korean. So I assume that is very likely to happen. More broadly, if, as seems quite likely, not certain, democratic countries try, particularly in the West, to reduce their dependence on China, to reduce, particularly in the technology sector, reduce their technological dependence on China, then they're obviously going to be looking for cooperation with other countries, democratic countries, which have very, very strong technology sectors. And there's no doubt, if you look out from Britain, South Korea is very much one of them. I mean, right at the forefront. So I would expect collaboration, just as Britain has a very strong position in life sciences, which is also well known. That's where we do relatively well. So it seems to me there are complementarities between our economies. The distances are very great, so it won't be enormous amounts, colossal amounts of trade. Distance matters, but there are natural complementarities and, of course, shared values. So I would hope that we will have a high level of cooperation economically as well as politically.
Western democracy, or liberal democracies rather, they were hoping that countries like China would someday change once they become substantially integrated into the global trade system and multilateral institutions. And while instead we saw China playing by its own rules and steadily increasing its grip on the international system, do you think it's going to be easy to decouple with China? And how do you think Beijing is going to react to this increased pressure from America and its allies?
That's an enormous question. And it has so many different components. I've never believed that China would become a normal democracy. But then I also don't believe that the present regime of China will necessarily stay the same forever. If China manages to maintain a regime like this when it becomes if and when it becomes a fully developed country, it will be unique. All other developed countries have sooner or later faced irresistible demands from the highly educated population that emerges in the natural course of development to give them more rights, more freedoms, more democracy, more liberty. I'm not convinced that that won't happen in China, but it's certainly not happening now. That's clear. So the question is, how does everyone else respond? And the FT has described what we need as realistic engagement or cooperation and competition. I don't think complete decoupling is possible. I think it will be very undesirable because I think China will be worse, not better, if it's completely cut off from the world. I think the Chinese people need to feel they're part of the world and the world doesn't reject them, even if it's very concerned about their regime. So we have to differentiate between the Chinese people and the Chinese regime. I think the solution is to define our common shared interests, define the areas where trade can proceed quite normally, define the areas where we're going to have to secure a degree of independence in trade and technology, make clear collectively, which Mr. Trump failed to do, what our demands from China in terms of behavior, in terms of intellectual property and trade and all the rest are. And finally, make absolutely clear, while we can't influence the way China governs itself, we will not accept Chinese interference in our own social and political life. And if China tries to use its clout, which is obviously growing, to stifle free speech, stifle the normal way of liberal democracies work, we will have to retaliate. And ideally, we will have to retaliate together. It's going to be very difficult and very complicated, but China's not going to go away. It's a huge power and it will become more so. We cannot cut it out of the world. That will be absurd. It's doing very well, obviously. But we do have to have a shared policy. And that's something I do hope we will get from the Biden administration, and we will be able to follow them.
And do you see a bigger role for countries like the UK and middle powers like South Korea or Canada, Australia in restoring this kind of liberal democracy and really establishing standards on key technologies like 5G as they really try and contain China?
If you look at the history of the World Trade Organization in particular and its precursor, the GATT, you will find very often medium powers played a crucial role in launching new initiatives. And the reason for that is they're not seen as threatening because they're not superpowers. They have a very profound shared interest in a working multilateral trading order, and they have influence with larger powers. The EU, the US particularly, probably less so with China. So I do hope that sovereign liberal democracies with advanced economies will be able to cooperate, particularly in the area of trade, to bring us back to a multilateral conception of how the trading system should work. Now, there's no great secret. I would have much preferred Britain to remain in the European Union. I think our leaving the EU was an enormous mistake. But given that that's happened, I do hope very much that Britain will play a role with this, and countries like South Korea should also play a very big role in trying to stabilize the multilateral order and think more broadly, to think globally, because despite the shift back to nationalism, it's obvious that we share one world. We do have one world economy to a significant degree. We can't change that. We share the world from an environmental point of view, and we have to cooperate, including, of course, with China.
And just out of curiosity, well, about Brexit, well, we heard earlier that today in Korea time, actually, that well, Boris Johnson and the EU Commissioner, they failed to really conclude their dinner with some sort of agreement on pushing through the Brexit deal. If there is a no-deal Brexit, then how do you think the trade talks would then proceed?
Well, if there's a no-deal Brexit, then that's it. There will be no trade deal, at least not now. It will be, I think, pretty chaotic next year and very costly for Britain in the short and medium and longer term. Now, what will then happen? I don't know. I would be pretty sure that that won't be the end of talks. But it might be the end of talks while Mr. Johnson is Prime Minister and possibly while this Conservative Party is in power. But a failure to reach an agreement, I think, would be a disaster for Britain. And in the longer run, it's going to trigger some very powerful processes, including possibly the separation of England and Scotland after 300 years together. And I would expect political changes to occur, which will ultimately lead necessarily to some deal with the EU, which is far and away, enormously far and away, the UK's most important trading partner. Personally, I think the issues over which Mr. Johnson refuses to compromise are absolutely grotesque, absurd, and he's making a gigantic mistake. But that looks like, right now, reading the news this morning, it looks as though there won't be a deal. It's the probability. But that will not be the end of the story. It just might be a long interregnum before the next stage in the negotiations.
And finally, before we let you go, in your most recent book, The Shifts and Shocks, What We've Learned and Have Still to Learn from the Financial Crisis, you said that the crisis of 2008 altered your views on economics, shifting it towards the Keynesian school of thought. And I thought, well, because of your rather reflexive thinking, the world turns to you for the very real insights and solutions to the very real problems that we have. So I was wondering whether this pandemic has changed your views in any way and how you think the world should, well, change its views and really adapt our thinking to the new normal.
It's not been as big a shock as the financial crisis, in the sense that the financial crisis was a failure in the economic system. And this is a real shock. It's from outside. It's a virus. I think it's not really changed my view as changed my understanding of how our politics work. There's nothing surprising about a pandemic. We've been warned many times that a pandemic was likely. What has surprised me is essentially two things. I've been surprised by the enormous variation in the ability of societies and governments to manage the pandemic. So obviously, everybody knows South Korea has done incredibly well in managing the pandemic. And European countries, North American countries, South American countries, and certainly including the UK, have done very, very badly. That surprised me. It surprised me the divergence was so massive. And the second thing that has surprised me is that what is, in terms of its epidemiological impact, not a particularly severe pandemic, much less severe as far as we can see than the Spanish flu of 100 years ago, relative to the population, that it's had such an enormous economic impact. And that has shown how fragile we are and how our societies respond. And I don't think I would have understood that fully until it happened. So we've learnt that pandemics can really devastate the economy, and we've learnt, therefore, that we must be much better prepared. And we've learnt, finally, that it is possible to respond to pandemics far, far better than we have in the West. And we're going to have to learn from that, very, very much so.
Well, that's where we're going to have to wrap up today, but that was Martin Wolf, Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator for the Financial Times, joining us. Again, thank you, sir, so much for making time for us.
It was a great pleasure, very stimulating. Thank you very much.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you for watching.